Dawn breaks slowly over the 7 hills, casting long shadows across marble columns that have witnessed the rise and fall of centuries. The morning light catches the gilded edges of bronze statues, their faces turned eternally toward a sun that once illuminated the greatest empire the world has ever known. In the gentle hours before the city awakens, when the only sounds are the distant murmur of fountains and the soft footfalls of temple attendants, it becomes possible to glimpse the ghost of what Rome once was, a city that stood at the very center of civilization, its power stretching from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. There was a time when the name of Rome carried the weight of destiny itself, when the eagle standards of its legions cast shadows across 3 continents, and when a single man's word could reshape the boundaries of the known world. This was the age of Augustus, the first and perhaps greatest of the Roman emperors, whose reign marked the beginning of 2 centuries of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The Pax Romana, as historians would later call it, represented more than mere absence of war. It was a golden thread woven through the fabric of time, binding together peoples and cultures under the protective embrace of Roman law and Roman order. Augustus himself had not been born to this destiny, born Gaius Octavius Thurinus. He was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, thrust into the violent whirlpool of late Republican politics when barely 20 years of age. The young man who would become the first emperor of Rome bore little resemblance to the conquering heroes of legend. He was slight of build, often sickly, and possessed of a calculating intelligence rather than the fierce charisma that had marked his famous relative. Yet it was precisely these qualities that would serve him well in the treacherous years following Caesar's assassination, when Rome teetered on the brink of permanent civil war. The transformation from Augustus the man to Augustus the institution occurred gradually, like the slow accumulation of sediment that builds a riverbank. Rather than seizing power through dramatic gestures, he collected it piece by piece, always maintaining the fiction that he was merely the first citizen among equals, the princeps who had restored the ancient traditions of the Republic. His genius lay not in conquest, but in consolidation, not in the thunder of battle, but in the quiet architecture of governance that would endure for centuries beyond his death. Under his careful stewardship, Rome evolved from a city-state that had accidentally acquired an empire into something far more sophisticated, a true imperial system that could govern diverse peoples across vast distances while maintaining the essential character that made it Roman. The streets of Rome itself became showcases of this new imperial grandeur. As Augustus famously boasted that he had found a city of brick and left it one of marble, the Forum Romanum expanded into a complex of gleaming temples and basilicas, while the Campus Martius bloomed with theatres, baths, and monuments that celebrated the achievements of the imperial house. The economic foundations of this golden age rested upon the tribute and trade that flowed into Rome from every corner of the Mediterranean world. Ships laden with grain from Egypt's fertile delta arrived at Ostia, Rome's bustling port, while caravans from the east brought silk, spices, and precious stones that filled the markets with exotic wonders. The standardized currency that bore Augustus's profile became the common medium of exchange from York to Alexandria, creating the world's first truly global economy. Roman roads, built with the precision of master engineers, carried not only legions and official messengers, but merchants and their goods, ideas, and innovations, binding the empire together with bands of stone and mortar. The legions themselves had been transformed from the rough citizen soldiers of the Republic into professional armies that served for 25 years under the eagles. These were men who knew no home but the camps, no loyalty but to Rome and their emperor, and no purpose but the defense and expansion of the imperial borders. Augustus stationed them in permanent fortresses along the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern frontiers, creating a military cordon that held back the barbarian tribes and rival powers that pressed against the empire's boundaries. The legionaries who manned these distant posts were more than soldiers. They were the living embodiment of Roman civilization, carrying with them the law, the language, and the customs that would gradually transform conquered territories into Roman provinces. In the great cities of the empire, from Lugdunum in Gaul to Antioch in Syria, local aristocrats began to adopt Roman dress, Roman architecture, and Roman ways of conducting business and public affairs. Their sons traveled to Rome itself to study rhetoric and law, returning home with Roman educations and Roman ambitions. The process of Romanization occurred not through force, but through the irresistible attraction of belonging to something larger and more magnificent than any local tradition could offer. The arts flourished under Augustus's patronage with a brilliance that would echo through the centuries. Virgil crafted the Aeneid, an epic that transformed the brutal realities of Roman conquest into a divine mission of destiny and civilization. Ovid's playful verses captured the sophistication and sensuality of imperial society, while Horace's odes celebrated the return of peace and prosperity after decades of civil strife. The emperor himself became a patron of architecture on an unprecedented scale, commissioning the theatre of Marcellus, the Forum of Augustus, and his own magnificent mausoleum, whose circular bulk still rises beside the Tiber like a small mountain of travertine and marble. The religious life of Rome underwent subtle but profound changes during Augustus's reign, as the emperor carefully positioned himself as the restorer of ancient piety while simultaneously introducing innovations that would alter the spiritual landscape forever. The old gods of the Republic, Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva, retained their honored places, but they were joined by new deities and new forms of worship that reflected Rome's expanded horizons. The cult of the emperor himself, while never officially acknowledged in Rome proper, flourished in the provinces, where grateful subjects erected temples to Augustus and Roma, the goddess who personified the eternal city. Perhaps most remarkably, this was an age when the very concept of Roman citizenship began to expand beyond its original narrow boundaries. Augustus granted citizenship selectively but meaningfully, recognizing that the empire's strength lay not merely in its military might but in the voluntary allegiance of its subjects. A merchant in Massilia, a veteran colonist in Spain, or a provincial magistrate in Asia Minor might all bear the proud title of Roman citizen, with all the legal protections and opportunities that such status conferred. This gradual extension of citizenship created bonds of loyalty that mere conquest could never achieve, binding the empire together with threads of shared identity and mutual interest. The peace that Augustus established was not merely the absence of war, but a positive force that allowed commerce, culture, and civilization to flourish as never before. Travelers could journey from Britain to Mesopotamia under the protection of Roman law, confident that the same legal principles that governed the Forum Romanum would protect their rights in the most distant provinces. The Mediterranean Sea, once a highway for pirates and a battlefield for rival powers, became a Roman lake where merchant vessels sailed under the protection of the imperial navy. As the years of Augustus's long reign accumulated like layers of sediment in the archaeological record, contemporaries began to sense that they were living through an extraordinary moment in human history. The poet Horace would later write of the Saculum Aureum, the golden age that had dawned with the first emperor's rise to power. It was a time when the promise of Rome, order, prosperity, and peace seemed finally to have been fulfilled, when the chaotic energies that had driven the Republic's expansion had been channeled into the steady rhythms of imperial administration and cultural achievement that would define civilization itself for centuries to come. The marble facades of Augustus's Rome still gleamed in the Mediterranean sun as the 2nd century drew to its close, but beneath the polished stone and carefully tended gardens, hairline cracks had begun to spread through the foundations of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Pax Romana, that golden peace which had settled like morning mist across 3 continents, was slowly beginning to evaporate under the weight of its own immense success. The very size that had once been Rome's greatest strength now became a source of mounting weakness. As communications stretched thin across vast distances and the machinery of governance groaned under the burden of administering territories that spanned from the windswept moors of Scotland to the sun-baked sands of the Sahara, the emperors who followed Augustus had inherited not just an empire but an intricate web of expectations, obligations, and delicate balances that required constant attention and ever-increasing resources to maintain. The legions that had once conquered new territories to fund their own expansion now found themselves stretched along thousands of miles of frontier, defending rather than acquiring, consuming wealth rather than generating it. The Rhine and Danube rivers, once natural boundaries that marked the edge of civilized Roman territory, had become pressure points where Germanic tribes pressed constantly against the imperial borders, testing for weaknesses like water seeping through the mortar of an aging wall. As the 3rd century dawned, the signs of strain were becoming impossible to ignore, though they manifested not as dramatic collapses but as a slow accumulation of seemingly manageable problems that gradually overwhelmed the empire's ability to respond effectively. The currency, once as solid and dependable as the roads that carried it across the known world, began to lose its weight and purity as emperors discovered the seductive ease of debasing silver coins to fund their increasingly desperate military campaigns. Each reduction in silver content was modest, barely noticeable to the average citizen holding the coins in their palm, but the cumulative effect rippled through the economy like stones dropped into a still pond. creating waves that would eventually reach every corner of the empire. The year 235 marked a watershed moment in Roman history, though those living through it could hardly have recognized the significance at the time. When the last of the Severan dynasty fell to assassination, the empire entered what historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of near-constant warfare, political chaos, and economic collapse that would fundamentally transform the nature of Roman power. The throne, once the apex of a carefully constructed system of laws and traditions, became little more than a prize to be seized by whoever could command the loyalty of the most legions, held briefly, and then lost again in an endless cycle of violence and betrayal. In the space of those 50 years, no fewer than 50 emperors claimed the purple, though many ruled for only months or even weeks before being overthrown or killed by rivals, subordinates, or enemies. The imperial palace in Rome, which had once been the serene center of a stable government, became a place of whispered conspiracies and sudden deaths where courtiers learned to shift their loyalties as quickly as weather vanes in a changing wind. Each new claimant to the throne brought with him a different faction, a different set of promises, and a different understanding of what the empire should become. But none possessed the resources or the time necessary to implement lasting solutions to the mounting crises that threatened to tear the Roman world apart. The frontiers, meanwhile, buckled under pressure from tribes that had grown increasingly bold and sophisticated in their military tactics. The Gothic Confederation, emerging from the forests and steppes beyond the Danube, launched devastating raids deep into Roman territory, their swift cavalry and siege techniques learned from contact with eastern nomads proving devastatingly effective against legions trained to fight in the disciplined formations that had served Rome so well in previous centuries. These were not the scattered warbands of earlier times, but organized armies capable of sustained campaigns, led by kings who understood Roman weaknesses and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. The Alemanni swept across the Rhine in wave after wave, penetrating as far as northern Italy before being turned back, while in the east, the Persian Empire under the aggressive Sassanid dynasty launched a series of campaigns that reclaimed much of Mesopotamia and even captured the Roman Emperor Valerian himself in 260, an unprecedented humiliation that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. The image of a Roman emperor in chains, forced to serve as a footstool for the Persian king, became a powerful symbol of imperial weakness that no amount of propaganda could entirely erase. As external pressures mounted, internal divisions multiplied with mathematical precision. The empire began to fragment not just politically, but geographically, as regional commanders declared themselves autonomous rulers rather than remain loyal to distant emperors who could offer them neither support nor security. The Gallic Empire emerged in the west, encompassing modern France, Britain, and parts of Germany, under the rule of Postumus, who established his capital at Trier and governed his breakaway territories with surprising effectiveness for nearly 15 years. In the east, the wealthy trading city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out its own sphere of influence, controlling Egypt and much of the Levant, while maintaining the fiction of loyalty to Rome, even as her armies marched under her own banners. The economic consequences of this political chaos rippled through every aspect of daily life across the empire. Trade routes that had functioned smoothly for centuries became hazardous as bandits multiplied in the absence of effective central authority. Cities that had grown wealthy on commerce found their markets disrupted, their currencies worthless, and their populations fleeing to the countryside in search of the basic security that urban life could no longer provide. The Great Road System, one of Rome's most enduring achievements, fell into disrepair as resources were diverted to immediate military needs rather than long-term infrastructure maintenance. Agriculture, the foundation of the ancient economy, suffered under the weight of crushing taxation imposed by desperate emperors seeking to fund their armies. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than work only to see their harvests confiscated by tax collectors or requisitioned by passing military units. The countryside, once dotted with prosperous villas and thriving market towns, began to empty as people sought refuge in fortified settlements or migrated to regions that offered greater stability. The very landscape of the empire was changing, as cultivated fields reverted to forest and abandoned cities crumbled back into the earth from which their stones had been quarried centuries before. The Roman military itself, once the most professional and disciplined force in the ancient world, transformed under these pressures into something barely recognizable. The traditional legions, recruited from Roman citizens and bound by oaths of loyalty to the state, gave way increasingly to units of foreign mercenaries whose primary allegiance was to whichever commander could pay them most regularly. Germanic warriors, Sarmatian cavalry, and Arab archers fought under Roman standards, bringing with them their own tactical traditions, religious beliefs, and cultural values that gradually altered the character of the imperial army from within. This transformation of the military reflected broader changes in Roman society as the rigid distinctions between citizen and foreigner, between Roman and barbarian, began to blur under the pressure of practical necessity. The empire had always been remarkably adaptable, absorbing and integrating conquered peoples, but the pace of change during the 3rd century accelerated beyond the capacity of traditional institutions to manage effectively. The result was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual metamorphosis, as the Rome of Augustus slowly evolved into something fundamentally different, carrying forward the name and many of the symbols of the old empire while embodying an entirely new reality beneath the familiar surface. From the ashes of the 3rd century's chaos, a figure emerged who would forever alter the trajectory of Roman civilization, though perhaps not in ways that would restore its former glory. Constantine, born into a world where the empire had been carved into competing fragments by military strongmen, rose through the ranks of a system that had grown accustomed to bloodshed as the primary means of succession. The son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the 4 rulers in Diocletian's carefully constructed tetrarchy, Constantine inherited not just ambition, but a keen understanding of how power had evolved in this new Roman world, where the old certainties had crumbled like parchment in flame. The early years of the 4th century found the empire still gasping from the wounds of the previous decades, its currency debased, its frontiers stretched thin, its population weary from constant warfare and taxation that pressed like a stone upon the chest of commerce and agriculture alike. Yet within this landscape of diminished expectations, Constantine recognized something that his rivals had missed entirely: the growing influence of a religious movement that had spread through the empire's cities like water seeping through limestone, invisible yet persistent, transforming everything it touched. Christianity, once the faith of slaves and social outcasts gathering in hidden chambers beneath Rome's busy streets, had evolved into something far more significant during the long decades of imperial crisis. While emperors fought each other for control of legions and provinces, Christian communities had quietly built networks that transcended traditional boundaries of class and citizenship, creating bonds of mutual support that functioned when imperial institutions failed. The faith had produced its own infrastructure of leadership and communication, its own systems of charity and education, its own sense of shared purpose that filled the vacuum left by the gradual erosion of civic pride and imperial loyalty. The persecution under Diocletian, intended to crush this growing movement once and for all, had instead revealed its remarkable resilience and the depth of its penetration into Roman society. Christians died in the arenas of their own cities, watched by neighbors who increasingly questioned whether these martyrs represented a threat to Roman order or perhaps embodied virtues that Rome itself had lost. The spectacle of execution, meant to demonstrate imperial power, instead highlighted the contrast between a government that ruled through fear and a community that seemed to welcome death rather than abandon its principles. Constantine's famous vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, whether genuine religious experience or calculated political theater, marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through every aspect of Roman life for generations to come. The Chi-Rho symbol blazing across the sky, the voice commanding him to conquer under this sign, the subsequent victory that made him sole ruler of the Western Empire, these elements combined to create a narrative that satisfied both Christian desire for divine vindication and pagan acceptance of supernatural intervention in human affairs. The Edict of Milan, issued the following year in partnership with his eastern counterpart Licinius, did far more than simply grant tolerance to Christian worship. It fundamentally altered the relationship between religious authority and imperial power, creating space for a new kind of legitimacy based not solely on military strength or senatorial approval, but on divine sanction interpreted through Christian theology. Constantine found himself navigating between his role as emperor in the traditional Roman sense and his growing identity as protector and patron of the Christian Church, a balancing act that required constant recalibration as both institutions adapted to their new relationship. The emperor's personal journey toward Christian faith unfolded gradually over the following decades, marked not by sudden conversion, but by a slow embrace of Christian symbols, advisors, and practices, while maintaining the traditional imperial role as Pontifex Maximus, supreme priest of the old Roman religious system. This careful dance between old and new reflected the broader challenge facing the empire itself: how to transform without completely abandoning the foundations upon which Roman identity had been built for nearly a millennium. Christian bishops, suddenly elevated from the shadows of persecution to positions of influence in imperial courts, found themselves wrestling with questions their predecessors could never have imagined. The relationship between earthly power and spiritual authority, the proper response to imperial favor, the challenge of maintaining religious integrity while accepting imperial patronage. These dilemmas created new tensions within Christian communities, even as they celebrated their liberation from fear of arrest and execution. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD demonstrated both the possibilities and the complications of this new arrangement. Constantine convened hundreds of bishops from across the empire to settle doctrinal disputes that were threatening to fragment the church just as it was emerging into public prominence. The emperor himself presided over theological debates concerning the nature of Christ's divinity, questions that might have seemed abstract to earlier generations of Romans, but now carried implications for imperial policy and social order. The resulting Nicene Creed established orthodox Christian doctrine with imperial backing, creating a template for the relationship between church and state that would endure for centuries. Yet this synthesis of Christian faith and Roman power came with costs that became apparent only gradually. Traditional Roman religious practices, intricately woven into civic life and cultural identity, began their slow retreat into rural areas and conservative families who clung to ancestral ways. The old gods who had supposedly protected Rome through its rise to greatness found their temples closed, their festivals discontinued, their priesthoods dissolved. This represented not merely a change in worship, but a fundamental rupture in the continuity of Roman culture, breaking links with traditions that stretched back to the legendary founders of the city. The economic implications of Constantine's religious revolution proved equally significant, though less immediately visible. Resources that had once flowed to traditional religious institutions, civic festivals, and public works projects were redirected toward church construction, Christian charity, and ecclesiastical hierarchies. New cities like Constantinople absorbed enormous investments that might otherwise have strengthened existing urban centers, while the gradual Christianization of imperial administration created new patterns of patronage and influence that bypassed traditional senatorial networks. Military culture, the backbone of Roman expansion and the foundation of imperial authority, underwent subtle but profound changes as Christian values began to influence recruitment, training, and military ethics. The warrior virtues that had carried Roman legions from Britain to Mesopotamia sat uneasily alongside Christian teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and the sanctity of life, creating internal contradictions that commanders and soldiers struggled to resolve in practical terms. Constantine's establishment of a new capital at Constantinople represented perhaps the most visible symbol of this transformed empire. Built on the site of ancient Byzantium, this new Rome was conceived from the beginning as a Christian city, its churches and palaces designed to reflect the fusion of imperial power and Christian faith that Constantine had achieved. Yet this eastern capital also represented a geographic shift that weakened Rome's position at the center of the Mediterranean world, distributing imperial resources and attention across an even wider area at a time when concentration of effort might have served the empire better. As Constantine's reign progressed through the 320s and 330s, the long-term consequences of his religious revolution became increasingly apparent. The empire had gained a new source of unity and purpose in Christian faith, but at the cost of ancient traditions and cultural continuities that had sustained Roman identity through previous crises. Whether this transformation represented renewal or decline remained an open question, its answer depending on perspectives shaped by faith, tradition, and the unpredictable currents of historical change that would continue to reshape the Roman world in ways that none of its contemporary observers could fully comprehend. The empire that Constantine had transformed through divine vision and architectural grandeur would find itself tested by forces far beyond its gilded borders, pressures that moved like slow tides across the vast steppes and forests of the northern world. Beyond the carefully maintained frontiers, where Roman watchtowers stood sentinel against the wilderness, entire peoples were stirring, their ancient ways of life disrupted by changes both climatic and political that rippled across the barbarian lands like stones cast into still water. The Huns had begun their westward migration from the Asian steppes, their horsemen appearing first as distant dust clouds on horizons that had known only the seasonal movement of herds and hunting parties. Under the leadership of formidable chieftains, these nomadic warriors possessed a mobility that seemed almost supernatural to the settled peoples of Europe. Their composite bows capable of deadly accuracy from horseback, their tactics refined by generations of warfare on the endless grasslands. As they pressed westward, the Hunnic advance displaced tribe after tribe, creating a cascade of movement that would reshape the entire demographic landscape of northern Europe. The Gothic peoples, who had long dwelled along the northern shores of the Black Sea, found themselves caught between the approaching storm of Hunnic raiders and the seemingly immovable barrier of Roman frontier defenses. These were not the savage barbarians of Roman propaganda, but sophisticated communities with their own rich traditions of metalwork, poetry, and governance. Peoples who had traded with Rome for generations and adopted many aspects of Roman culture while maintaining their distinctive identity. The pressure from the east forced impossible choices upon Gothic kings and clan leaders, decisions that would echo through history as they weighed the familiar dangers of Roman subjugation against the unknown terrors represented by the approaching nomadic hordes. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, emerged as a figure who embodied the complex relationship between Rome and its barbarian neighbors. A leader educated in Roman military tactics, yet bound by the ancient loyalties of his people. His warriors were both enemies and allies of Rome, sometimes serving as federati in the imperial armies, sometimes raiding the very territories they had been paid to protect. The Gothic warbands moved with a fluidity that confounded Roman military doctrine, appearing suddenly to threaten vital supply lines before melting away into the forests and marshlands that lay beyond the reach of Roman cavalry. The Rhine frontier, that ancient boundary between civilization and barbarism in Roman minds, began to buckle under the mounting pressure of displaced populations seeking new homes. The Vandals, Suebi, and Alans, driven by the same westward tide that had displaced the Goths, gathered in massive confederations along the river's eastern banks, their campfires stretching for miles through the winter darkness of 406. These were not merely raiding parties, but entire peoples on the move, carrying with them their families, livestock, and household goods, seeking not plunder but permanent settlement in lands that could support their traditional ways of life. The great crossing of the frozen Rhine on that fateful New Year's Eve marked a watershed moment in European history as thousands upon thousands of barbarian warriors, accompanied by their families and followers, streamed across the icebound river into Gaul. The Roman defenders, thinned by years of civil war and the constant demands of multiple frontiers, could offer only token resistance to this massive influx of humanity. The barbarian tribes spread across the fertile plains of Gaul like floodwaters, some seeking accommodation with local Roman authorities, others simply taking what they needed by force. Gaul, that most Romanized of provinces, found its carefully cultivated landscape of villas, cities, and agricultural estates transformed almost overnight into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms and diminished Roman enclaves. The Burgundians established themselves in the Rhone Valley, the Visigoths carved out territories in the southwest, while the Vandals continued their relentless march toward the Mediterranean and eventually into North Africa. Each of these peoples brought their own customs, laws, and social structures, creating a complex mosaic of cultures that would define medieval Europe. The pressure on Rome's frontiers was not merely military but demographic and economic, as the empire struggled to absorb, integrate, or repel populations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The traditional Roman policy of selective recruitment and gradual Romanization proved inadequate to the scale of the crisis, while attempts at wholesale deportation or military solution exceeded the empire's increasingly strained resources. Many barbarian groups were granted federati status, becoming nominally allied troops in service to Rome, but these arrangements often proved temporary as changing circumstances shifted the balance of power and loyalty. The Hunnic Empire under Attila represented the culmination of these nomadic pressures, a confederation that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea and commanded the allegiance or tributary submission of dozens of barbarian peoples. Attila's court, established in wooden halls on the Hungarian plain, became a center of diplomacy and intrigue that rivaled Constantinople or Ravenna, where Roman ambassadors bearing gold and silk negotiated treaties with a barbarian king who held the fate of the Western Empire in his scarred hands. The very existence of such a power beyond Rome's borders represented a fundamental shift in the balance of European politics. The Siege of Orleans and the subsequent Battle of the Catalonian Plains demonstrated both the extent of Hunnic power and the desperate measures required to contain it. as Romans and Visigoths fought side by side against an enemy that threatened to sweep away all existing political arrangements. The massive scale of these conflicts, involving armies that dwarfed the legions of earlier centuries, reflected the new reality of barbarian Europe, where tribal confederations could field forces that matched or exceeded those of the Roman state. The death of Attila and the subsequent collapse of the Hunnic Confederation brought little relief to the beleaguered empire, as the subject peoples who had served in Hunnic armies were now free to pursue their own territorial ambitions. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric eventually established a kingdom in Italy itself, while other groups continued the pattern of migration and settlement that had begun centuries earlier, with the first stirrings of barbarian unrest along the distant frontiers. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, as Roman institutions adapted to accommodate barbarian law and custom, while barbarian rulers adopted the symbols and ceremonies of Roman authority. The Great Migrations had not destroyed Roman civilization, but had fundamentally altered its character, creating a new world in which the descendants of barbarian warriors would rule from the palaces of Caesar, governing subjects who spoke Latin and followed Roman law, while maintaining the tribal loyalties and warrior customs of their ancestors. The empire had not ended with a single catastrophic defeat, but had been gradually transformed by the slow pressure of peoples seeking new homes in a changing world. The relentless pressure from beyond the frontier had revealed something profound about the nature of the Roman Empire itself, an empire that had grown so vast, so complex, that governing it from a single center had become like trying to conduct an orchestra from another continent. The barbarian migrations had not merely threatened Roman territory, they had exposed the fundamental impossibility of maintaining unified control over lands that stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked sands of the Sahara, from the Atlantic's grey waters to the fertile banks of the Euphrates. In the palaces of power, where marble corridors echoed with the whispered conversations of advisors and the soft rustle of silk robes, a revolutionary idea began to take shape. The empire that had once prided itself on its unity, on the singular authority of Caesar, would divide itself in two. It was a decision born not of weakness, but of pragmatic necessity, like a great tree that splits its trunk to better weather the storm. The year 285 brought with it the Emperor Diocletian, a man whose vision would reshape the very foundation of Roman governance. Diocletian understood that the empire had become a creature too large for any single hand to guide. From his chambers overlooking the Bosphorus, where the morning light caught the gold leaf on ceremonial shields and illuminated the intricate mosaics that told stories of conquest and glory, he contemplated a solution as audacious as it was logical. The Western territories, with their Celtic mists and Germanic forests, their Gallic vineyards and Spanish olive groves, would form one realm. The eastern lands, where Greek philosophy still echoed through marble academies, and where the ancient wisdom of Egypt mingled with the commercial acumen of Syria, would constitute another. The administrative machinery that emerged from this division was like watching a master craftsman create two perfect timepieces from the gears and springs of one magnificent but unwieldy clock. In the west, the imperial capital would remain at Rome, that eternal city where the Forum still bustled with merchants and senators, where the Pantheon's great dome caught the afternoon sun like a crown of stone and bronze. The eastern capital would eventually rise at Constantinople, that gleaming jewel positioned where Europe met Asia, where the waters of the Golden Horn reflected the spires of palaces and the sails of merchant vessels carrying silk and spices from distant lands. Each half of the empire developed its own distinct rhythm, like twin hearts beating in separate chambers. The Western territories retained much of the old Roman character, the Latin language rolling off tongues in senatorial debates, the traditional gods receiving their ancient honors in temples thick with incense smoke, the legal traditions that had been refined over centuries of jurisprudence. Here, in cities like Milan and Trier, the imperial court maintained the ceremonial grandeur that Romans had perfected over generations, with purple-clad officials moving through marble halls adorned with frescoes depicting military victories and pastoral scenes. Meanwhile, in the East, a different flavor of Roman civilization began to emerge. Greek became the language of scholarship and administration, its melodic cadences heard in the lecture halls of Constantinople's universities and in the heated theological debates that echoed through cathedral corridors. The Eastern Empire embraced Christianity with a fervor that transformed not only religious practice, but the very aesthetics of imperial power. Golden mosaics depicted Christ in majesty alongside earthly emperors, and the sound of Byzantine chant began to replace the ancient hymns to Jupiter and Mars. The two capitals developed their own unique splendors, each reflecting the character of its realm. Rome, despite its political eclipse, remained the symbolic heart of Western tradition. Its 7 hills still crowned with magnificent temples and palaces, its streets still paved with the stones that had witnessed triumph after triumph, its very air still thick with the memory of countless generations who had called themselves citizens of the eternal city. The morning mist that rose from the Tiber carried with it the whispers of history, the accumulated weight of centuries that had seen this city grow from a collection of mud huts to the center of the known world. Constantinople, by contrast, embodied the empire's eastern ambitions and adaptations. Built where ancient Byzantium had once stood guard over the narrow strait that separated 2 continents, the new capital gleamed with fresh marble and gold leaf, its architecture blending classical Roman forms with influences drawn from across the eastern Mediterranean. The great harbor curved like a sheltering arm around the city's base, its waters dotted with vessels from Egypt and India, from the Black Sea grain ports and the spice markets of Arabia. The imperial palace complex rose in terraced splendor, its halls adorned with silks that caught the light like captured rainbows, its courtyards filled with the sound of fountains and the gentle cooing of doves. This division created a fascinating duality in Roman governance and culture. 2 emperors now ruled where once there had been one, each maintaining separate courts, separate armies, separate administrative hierarchies. The Western Augustus might spend his mornings reviewing reports from Gallic provinces, while his Eastern counterpart dedicated the same hours to matters concerning the Anatolian theme system. Yet both still considered themselves Roman, still drew their authority from the same ancient sources, still maintained the forms and ceremonies that had been hallowed by centuries of tradition. The relationship between these 2 halves of the empire resembled that of siblings who had grown up in the same household but had developed distinctly different personalities. They cooperated when external threats demanded unity, yet each pursued policies suited to their particular circumstances and challenges. The West grappled more directly with the barbarian migrations, developing new forms of military organization and diplomatic accommodation. The East, more insulated by geography and better positioned economically, could afford to maintain older Roman traditions while simultaneously evolving new forms of governance and culture. Communication between the 2 capitals became a complex dance of diplomacy and family politics. Imperial messengers rode the great highways that still connected the furthest reaches of Roman territory, carrying sealed documents that might contain anything from requests for military assistance to formal protocols for shared religious ceremonies. The roads themselves remained marvels of engineering, their stone surfaces worn smooth by countless travelers, their bridges spanning rivers with the same confident arch that Roman engineers had perfected centuries earlier. As the seasons turned and the years accumulated, this division began to seem less like a temporary administrative convenience and more like a permanent transformation of Roman identity itself. The empire that had once been a single organism was becoming 2 related but distinct entities, each developing its own solutions to the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories. The barbarian pressures that had necessitated this division continued to shape both realms, but now each could respond with the flexibility and focus that unified control had made impossible. In the evening light that bathed both Rome and Constantinople, as shadows lengthened across marble forums and golden domes caught the last rays of the setting sun, the Roman Empire continued its evolution. The ancient dream of universal dominion was transforming into something more complex but perhaps more sustainable. 2 centers of Roman civilization, each adapted to its particular world, each carrying forward the legacy of Rome in its own distinctive way. The twin capitals of East and West would endure for several decades, their marble columns catching the morning light while bureaucrats shuffled through corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of unified imperial power. Yet, even as Constantinople grew in splendor, its golden domes reflecting the waters of the Bosphorus, the western seat of empire faced mounting pressures that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Rome itself, the eternal city that had given its name to an empire stretching from Britain to the Sahara, would witness scenes that earlier generations could never have conceived possible. The year 410 brought with it a chill that penetrated deeper than the usual Roman winter. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had grown weary of negotiations with imperial officials who promised much but delivered little. His warriors, seasoned by years of conflict and migration, had gathered outside the ancient walls, where Romulus was said to have drawn the original boundaries of the city. The sounds of their encampment carried across the Tiber, the neighing of horses, the clang of metal being sharpened, the low murmur of conversations in Germanic tongues that would have been foreign to the senators who still met in their marble halls. For 3 days the city held its breath, markets closing, citizens barricading their doors with furniture that had been crafted by artisans whose grandfathers had known Augustus. When the gates finally opened, whether through treachery or simple exhaustion, the flood of warriors that poured through the streets marked the first successful foreign conquest of Rome in 8 centuries. The Visigoths moved through neighborhoods where patrician families had maintained their ancestral homes for generations, past temples where incense had burned continuously since the Republic's earliest days. They were not mindless destroyers. Indeed, Alaric had specifically ordered his men to respect Christian churches and leave the populace largely unharmed. Yet the psychological impact of seeing barbarian warriors walking freely through the Forum Romanum, where Cicero had delivered his orations and Caesar had accepted his triumphs, resonated far beyond the city's ancient boundaries. The sack lasted 3 days, and when the Visigoths departed, they carried with them wagons laden with gold, silver, and precious objects that had adorned Roman homes and temples for centuries. More significantly, they took with them Galla Placidia, sister of the Emperor Honorius, whose subsequent marriage to Alaric's successor would symbolize the complex relationships between Romans and the peoples they had once considered barbarians. The city they left behind was physically intact but spiritually transformed. No longer the inviolable center of the world, but simply another settlement that could be taken by those with sufficient determination and strength. Word of Rome's fall spread along the empire's ancient road networks with the speed of imperial post riders, reaching distant provinces where local populations struggled to comprehend what they had heard. In North Africa, Augustine would later write of his shock and sorrow, while in Britain, Roman officials began to sense that their connection to the wider empire might be more tenuous than they had previously imagined. The psychological blow was perhaps more devastating than the physical damage. If Rome itself could fall, what security could any corner of the empire claim? The aftermath of Fort 10 revealed the fundamental weakness that had been growing within the imperial system for generations. Central authority, once exercised with confident efficiency from the 7 hills, now struggled to respond effectively to crises that seemed to multiply faster than solutions could be implemented. Provincial governors found themselves increasingly isolated, making decisions based on local circumstances rather than imperial directives that might take months to arrive or might never come at all. The great administrative machine that had once coordinated the activities of millions of people across 3 continents began to resemble a complex clockwork mechanism whose springs had begun to weaken. Tax collection, the lifeblood of any imperial system, became increasingly difficult as regions fell under the control of various barbarian kingdoms or simply declared their independence from a central authority that could no longer protect them. The Spanish provinces watched Gothic armies establish permanent settlements in their territories. Gaul saw Burgundians and Franks carving out kingdoms from lands that had been Roman for 4 centuries. Even Italy itself became a patchwork of competing authorities, with various Germanic chieftains establishing their own spheres of influence while maintaining the fiction of serving Rome. The imperial court at Ravenna, safer behind its marshes than Rome would ever be again, continued to issue laws and proclamations that carried decreasing weight with each passing year. Emperors who had never commanded an army in the field appointed generals whose primary qualification was often their ability to negotiate with barbarian leaders rather than defeat them in battle. The purple that had once symbolized absolute authority over the known world became increasingly a ceremonial garment worn by figureheads whose actual power extended little beyond their immediate surroundings. Trade routes that had carried goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other began to fragment as political control became unreliable. Merchants who had once planned voyages with confidence in Roman naval protection found themselves negotiating safe passage with a bewildering array of local strongmen and petty kings. The standardized currency that had facilitated commerce from York to Alexandria became less reliable as various authorities began minting their own coins or reverting to barter systems that their grandfathers would have considered primitively archaic. The very concept of Roman citizenship, once a coveted prize that elevated individuals above local tribal affiliations, began to lose its meaning as the institutions that had given it substance crumbled or transformed beyond recognition. Men who bore Roman names and had been educated in classical literature found themselves serving barbarian kings who valued their administrative skills while caring little for their imperial pedigree. The boundaries between Roman and barbarian became increasingly fluid, with intermarriage and cultural exchange creating new hybrid societies that bore elements of both traditions while belonging fully to neither. In the Eastern Territories, the empire that would become known to history as Byzantine continued to function with considerable effectiveness, its bureaucrats maintaining detailed records and its armies defending frontiers with professional competence. Yet even there, the loss of the western provinces represented a fundamental shift in the empire's center of gravity. Resources that had once flowed from the rich agricultural lands of North Africa and the commercial centers of Gaul were no longer available to support imperial ambitions. The dream of universal Roman rule, which had sustained emperors and their subjects through previous crises, began to fade like evening shadows lengthening across abandoned forums where weeds pushed through marble pavements that had once witnessed the passage of triumphal processions celebrating victories that had expanded Roman dominion to the edges of the known world. As the dust settled over the Seven Hills after Alaric's withdrawal, and later as Genseric's Vandals departed with their precious cargo, Rome found itself transformed into something unrecognizable from the eternal city that had once commanded the world. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, though still magnificent in its marble grandeur, echoed with a different quality of footsteps now, tentative, uncertain, the measured paces of men who wore purple but commanded little beyond the walls of their own chambers. The great machinery of empire, once oiled by tribute from Britain to Egypt, now creaked and groaned like an ancient water wheel whose stream had been diverted elsewhere. In these twilight decades of the 5th century, a succession of figures occupied the throne of the Caesars, each casting longer shadows than their predecessors as the sun of Roman power sank lower on the horizon. Their names, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, would be etched in marble and recorded in chronicles. Yet even as the scribes carved their letters into stone, the wind seemed to whisper of impermanence. These were not the autocrats of old commanding legions across 3 continents, but rather the inheritors of a dream whose substance had long since evaporated, leaving only the gossamer threads of ceremony and the fading echo of ancient glory. The palace courtiers still performed their elaborate rituals of obeisance, still prostrated themselves before the dais where the emperor sat clothed in silk the color of imperial sunset. The same incense burned in the same bronze censers, releasing clouds of frankincense and myrrh that had perfumed the air for centuries. Yet beneath this veneer of continuity, the very foundations of power had shifted like sand beneath a temple built too close to the shore. The barbarian kings, who had once knelt as foederati, now corresponded as equals, their letters bearing seals that gleamed with the authority of conquest rather than the borrowed luster of imperial favor. Majorian, who ascended to power in 457, possessed perhaps the last genuine spark of the old Roman fire. His campaigns beyond the Alps carried something of the ancient vigor, his attempts to restore the navy echoing the maritime ambitions of earlier centuries when Roman triremes had swept the Mediterranean clear of pirates and rivals alike. The workshops of Ravenna rang once more with the sound of shipwrights' hammers, and for a brief moment the dream of reconquest seemed to flutter like a banner in the salt wind off the Adriatic. Yet even this emperor, the most capable of his generation, found himself dancing to melodies composed by barbarian kings whose loyalty could be purchased but never truly commanded. The great irony of these final decades lay in how closely they resembled the early days of the empire when Augustus had maintained the fiction of the restored republic while wielding unprecedented power behind a veil of traditional forms. Now the process had reversed itself. The forms remained magnificent, the titles still carried their ancient weight, but the substance had leaked away like wine from a cracked amphora. Senators still gathered in their togas, still debated with the elaborate courtesy of their forebears, yet their discussions centered increasingly on local concerns, on the price of grain in the markets of Rome, on the repair of aqueducts that served a city whose population had dwindled to a fraction of its former multitudes. The Germanic kingdoms that had established themselves across the former provinces maintained their own elaborate charades of legitimacy. Theodoric the Great, ruling from Ravenna, surrounded himself with the trappings of Roman authority, while his Gothic warriors stood guard in the marble corridors, where once the Praetorian Guard had kept watch. The Visigothic kingdom in Hispania issued laws in Latin, appointed Roman administrators to key positions, and maintained the old forms of taxation and governance. Yet beneath this surface continuity, a fundamental transformation was occurring as surely as winter gradually yielded to spring. In these strange twilight years, the boundaries between Roman and barbarian became increasingly blurred, like watercolors bleeding together on damp parchment. The sons of Germanic chieftains studied rhetoric in schools where Cicero and Virgil were still revered, while Roman aristocrats found themselves learning the customs and languages of their new overlords. Marriages between the old nobility and the new warrior elite created bloodlines that carried both the purple stripe of senatorial rank and the amber ornaments of tribal kingship. The emperor Anthemius, who ruled in the 460s, embodied this strange new world in his very person, a Greek from Constantinople who wore the crown of the Western emperors, while relying on Visigothic and Burgundian allies to maintain his precarious hold on power. His court in Rome became a fascinating study in cultural synthesis, where barbarian kings dined on gold plate, while Roman senators learned to appreciate the epic poetry of Germanic bards. The emperor himself moved through this world with the careful grace of a diplomat in a foreign land, which in many ways he was, even though he sat on the throne of his ancestors. As the 470s dawned, the fiction of imperial authority became increasingly difficult to maintain. The emperor Julius Nepos, ruling from the relative safety of Ravenna, while Rome itself fell under the sway of various strongmen, represented perhaps the clearest acknowledgement that the old order had finally exhausted itself. His edicts carried less weight than the commands of Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain, whose Scaramé warriors had become the de facto guardians of Italy. The emperor's own bodyguard consisted largely of barbarian mercenaries, whose loyalty extended only as far as their next payment, and whose allegiance to the purple was tempered by older loyalties to clan and tribe. The administrative machinery of empire, that vast bureaucratic organism that had once digested the wealth of the world and transformed it into roads, aqueducts, and legions, now functioned like a clock whose mainspring had broken. Provincial governors still issued reports, tax collectors still made their rounds, and scribes still filled their ledgers with neat columns of figures. Yet increasingly these activities took on the quality of theatrical performance rather than genuine governance. The real business of ruling, of maintaining order, defending borders, and ensuring prosperity, had long since passed to other hands. In the scriptoriums where monks copied ancient texts, the works of Livy and Tacitus were preserved alongside the chronicles of contemporary events, and perhaps nowhere was the contrast more striking than in these quiet chambers, where the past and present lay side by side on reading stands of polished wood. The grand narratives of conquest and triumph, of eagles carried to the ends of the earth, and barbarian kings led in golden chains through the streets of Rome, shared shelf space with accounts of negotiation and accommodation, of emperors who ruled by sufferance, and Romans who prospered under barbarian protection. The city of Rome itself had become a museum of its former greatness, its monuments standing like ancient trees in a forest where the soil had grown too thin to nourish new growth. The Colosseum still dominated the skyline, its massive bulk a testament to the engineering prowess of earlier generations, yet the elaborate gladiatorial contests that had once thrilled hundreds of thousands had given way to smaller spectacles, funded by Germanic kings who understood the importance of bread and circuses even as they wore the skins of wolves rather than the purple of emperors. The Forum Romanum, once the beating heart of a world empire, now hosted markets where Gothic merchants sold amber and furs to Roman patricians who paid with coins bearing the profiles of rulers whose authority scarcely extended beyond the city walls. Thus did the empire that had begun with Augustus's careful balance of innovation and tradition end not with the crash of falling walls or the clash of final battles, but with a gradual fading like twilight settling over the Tiber, as the last emperors played out their roles in a drama whose conclusion had already been written by forces too vast and inexorable for any single will to deflect. The great transformation that followed Rome's collapse was not the sudden death of a civilization, but rather its gentle metamorphosis into something entirely different, like autumn leaves slowly changing color before drifting to the forest floor. In the territories that had once echoed with the measured steps of legions, new kingdoms emerged, their boundaries drawn not by the straight lines of Roman roads but by the meandering paths of tribal migrations and local allegiances. The Germanic chieftains who had once pressed against Rome's borders now found themselves rulers of lands where Roman villas still dotted the countryside, their mosaic floors gathering dust while new forms of governance took root in the fertile soil of the fallen empire. Constantinople, the eastern jewel that had inherited Rome's imperial crown, continued to gleam across the Bosphorus for another 1,000 years, its golden domes catching the morning light as Byzantine emperors maintained the fiction that they were still Roman. Within those walls, Scholars preserved the written treasures of antiquity, copying manuscripts by candlelight in scriptorium chambers, where the scratch of quill on parchment became a whispered prayer for knowledge to survive the darkness. The great libraries of the East became arks carrying the wisdom of ages across the flood of time, ensuring that Cicero's speeches and Virgil's verses would someday echo again in distant lands not yet dreamed of. In the West, where Rome itself had become just another city among many, the Catholic Church emerged as the inheritor of imperial authority, its bishops wearing the purple of ancient magistrates and its pope claiming the title that had once belonged to emperors. The basilicas that rose from the ruins of pagan temples carried forward Rome's architectural DNA, their columns and arches speaking in the same stone language that had once proclaimed imperial glory. Monasteries scattered across the European landscape became islands of learning, where monks in brown robes tended not only to gardens and vineyards, but to the fragile shoots of literacy and scholarship that would eventually bloom into universities and Renaissance academies. The roads that had carried Rome's armies to the edges of the known world still stretched across continents, though grass now grew between their stones and merchants' carts had replaced military columns. These ancient pathways became the arteries through which new ideas flowed, carrying not Roman lore and Latin literature, but the songs of troubadours, the theories of Islamic mathematicians, and the spices of Asian markets. Along these roads, pilgrims walked toward shrines that had replaced temples, their footsteps wearing smooth the same stones that had once supported the sandaled feet of Caesar's legions. Rome's greatest gift to the future lay not in its monuments or its conquests, but in the invisible architecture of law and language that had grown so deeply into the soil of civilization that it could never be fully uprooted. Latin evolved and fractured, becoming the romantic tongues that would carry poetry and philosophy into new ages, each daughter language bearing within its grammar the ghostly echoes of Roman senators debating in marble halls. The legal principles that had emerged from centuries of jurisprudence became the foundation stones upon which modern nations would build their courts and constitutions, ensuring that concepts of justice and citizenship that had first been forged in the Roman Forum would shape the dreams of peoples not yet born. In the quiet villages of what had once been Gaul and Hispania, farmers still planted their crops according to agricultural wisdom that stretched back to Columella's treatises, their plows following furrows first cut by Roman colonists. The wine that flowed from hillside vineyards carried flavors that had been cultivated by imperial vintners, each vintage a liquid link to a vanished world. Water still flowed through aqueduct channels that Roman engineers had carved from living rock, bringing the cool gift of mountain springs to cities whose names had been forgotten, but whose people still bathed in Rome's generous waters. The transformation touched even the deepest levels of human consciousness, as Roman concepts of time and space became woven into the fabric of Western thought. The calendar that marked the passage of seasons still bore the names of Roman gods and emperors, each month a small memorial to vanished glory. The very notion of civilization itself had been shaped by Roman hands, carrying within it assumptions about law, order, and urban life that would influence human societies for millennia to come. Artists and architects of later ages would return again and again to Roman forms, finding in classical proportions and imperial grandeur an eternal language of beauty and power. Renaissance palaces would echo with Roman rhythms, their facades speaking in Latin even when their builders could barely conjugate a verb. The dome of St. Peter's would reach toward heaven with the same ambition that had raised the Pantheon, while countless Capitol buildings across the world would wrap themselves in Roman columns, as if donning the toga of ancient authority. Even as Rome's eagles had fallen silent, the empire's most profound legacy lived on in the realm of ideas and aspirations. The dream of universal law, of citizenship that transcended tribal boundaries, of a world united under common institutions, these visions would resurface again and again throughout history, inspiring everything from medieval kingdoms to modern democracies. The Roman notion that government should serve justice rather than mere power would echo through centuries of political philosophy, a whispered reminder of what human societies might achieve when they reached toward their highest ideals. In the end, Rome's true triumph lay not in the territories it had conquered or the enemies it had defeated, but in the quiet persistence of its influence across the ages. Like seeds scattered by autumn winds, Roman ideas took root in soil the legions had never touched, growing into institutions and traditions that would have seemed miraculous to Caesar himself. The empire that had begun with a city on 7 hills had become something far greater than any earthly kingdom. It had become a permanent part of human consciousness, a golden thread woven so deeply into the tapestry of civilization that it could never be pulled free. As night settles over the ruins of the Palatine Hill, where emperors once walked in purple magnificence, the Eternal City rests beneath stars that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Rome sleeps now in its own transformation, no longer the capital of the world, but something perhaps more enduring, the eternal memory of what human ambition and wisdom might accomplish when they worked together across the centuries, building not just in stone and bronze, but in the more lasting materials of law, language,